Modern Money Primer blog number 45. Responses by L. Randall Wray. I am responding quickly because the Minsky-Levy-Ford conference in New York City starts today. Question 1. I've been thinking a lot about the problems with imports and the like because it directly affects, for example, Greece should they exit the euro. If they do so, their large dependence on imports will likely lead to a serious inflation. Another concrete example of heavy dependence on imports is apparently Argentina. A large amount of the inflation there, which, to my mind, could undermine the credibility of the Kirchner government if allowed run too long, is apparently due to the cost of imports. Is the most elegant solution to this not to work on the supply side? Answer. Agreed, especially for developing nations that do not produce much that is in demand outside of their country. This is particularly true of nations that rely on subsistence agriculture. The job guarantee can be used as a tool for development, including development of exports and/or tourism. Question 2. Inflation in Argentina is an enigma. Government says one thing and then the media claims, no, real inflation must be double. But as Paul Krugman says, this would mean GDP deflator would have to double as well, and that would mean all the growth in Argentina for the last decade would have been mirage. There would have not been growth at all. A large amount of the inflation there is apparently due to the cost of imports. I would think it would be the other way around, that high nominal price pressures in domestic economy depreciate the currency, and that raises the cost of imports. Maybe these pressures could be result of cost of living adjustments, COLA, in the labor contracts. Who knows? More research would be needed. And I would think that in the presence of these kinds of COLA contracts, not even the job guarantee would bring price stability, or in the presence of powerful unions outbidding each other. Continuing price pressures could lead to oversized job guarantee pool, as inflation eats away value of government debt, outside wealth in MMT, or right-wing backlash as they seek any reason to make life harder for the poor. Inflation would be the perfect excuse. Answer. Agreed. Automatic indexing can be a big problem. It builds inflation into the system. This was the Brazilian problem. It was a major point made by Bresser in his analysis of Brazilian inflation, especially indexing of government payments, government employees plus contractual payments for everything. Breaking this cycle is painful. Note, we do not advocate automatic indexing of the job guarantee wage, rather periodic adjustment. The more frequent the adjustment, the less effective it is at stabilizing wages and prices. Question 3. Hefe's workers produce uniforms for the government. Why a job guarantee employer of last resort program to produce uniforms for the government? If there are clothing manufacturers in the economy, why not buy from them? Apparently, there were none before, and the government uniforms were imported. Could the government not simply advertise that it would pay extra for domestically produced uniforms, and a uniform company would be started? Maybe this company could then produce clothing for the domestic market as well, at a competitive price. Answer. This is horses for courses. Developing nations typically do not produce everything that is required. Indeed, in some cases they produce little beyond food for subsistence. The private sector is typically very small. It makes sense to use the job guarantee to replace imports by producing things that are needed domestically. School uniforms for kids can be an important product. In such situations, reducing imports can be critical. In Argentina, the clothing sector had been foreign-owned, and in the crisis the owners just abandoned the factories. See the excellent documentary on worker takeovers. Co-ops became an important movement, and many Hefe's projects were organized as co-ops. It is a good experiment. Question 4. The floating exchange rate is critical in giving the monetary sovereign government policy space to pursue full employment. More specifically, it is not actually a willingness to allow the exchange rate to deteriorate that gives them this policy space. But isn't a falling exchange rate harmful too, perhaps just as harmful as domestic inflation? And would not the policies to prevent it, such as tariffs, import controls, and capital controls, be harmful too? I can see that if every country emphasized full employment and provided the deficits to support it, then exchange rates would all suffer equally, which is to say they need not change much at all. Is that where we need to be going? Can this stuff work, really, in one country at a time, especially a really large and relatively free economy like the US, where tariffs, import controls, and capital controls are unlikely to be used? Answer: impossible to make a general statement on whether falling exchange rate is good or bad. Depends on situation. It helps the export sector, but does tend to be inflationary. Note Australia deals with wide flux of its exchange rate and thus terms of trade, as do most commodity exporters that float. Read Bill Mitchell on this. Note also many developing nations do not float. I have tried to offer an analysis of the job guarantee even for these nations. If they do not float, imports and thus pressures on exchange rates are a much more serious problem. Finally, although I did not discuss it here, capital controls are available and probably should be used by small developing nations.